Hello there, good afternoon. I'm Phil Browning Helsel here from Austin Seminary, and I'm talking about a book, a really helpful book by Dianne Crowther called Sustaining Persons Grieving Losses, a fresh approach to the challenges of the dementia journey. And above me in the back, I've got the chapters laid out there for you. Chapter 1 is Grounding Care, Sustaining Persons in Context. Chapter 2 is Grounding Pastoral Care, Spirituality and Meaning. And here's where the rubber really starts to hit the road, or she starts to take off. Chapter 3, Caregiving, a Lived Experience. Chapter 4, Caregiver's Journey, Themes and Meanings. Chapter 5, Grieving Losses, The Long Goodbye. Chapter 6, Local Pastoral Practice. Chapter 7, Theological Foundations for Care. Chapter 8, A Pastoral Approach. And Chapter 9, Moving Forward. So Dianne Crowther seems like she's a long-time chaplain and with a lot of pastoral experience coming out of New Zealand or Australia. And so what this book does significantly is it contributes to the literature on the care for caregivers of dementia from a pastoral theological perspective. We had a book by John Swinton a few years ago called Dementia, which was an excellent theological account of this experience and problem. But from using it with students, I found that they didn't really have enough of the day-to-day journey for the caregiver. It was more theology, and then caregivers were kind of left on their own to figure out how it played. So let's begin with Grounding Care, Chapter 1. So in these first few chapters, she is going to review Swinton. She's going to review Kitwood. She's going to review Sabat, some of the major figures in dementia theory. She says that we're created by God, and she wonders whether people with dementia are lost and forgotten. And the question then becomes, where is their personhood? And she insists that personhood is given by God, who reaches out to humans. And she says that something really interesting. She says that our bodies come first. So her approach to pastoral care is rooted in embodiment in this first chapter. She says the body is prior to the self and cannot be separated from it. And that's how she's going to root her dementia approach. And that's going to give her an emphasis on a care for the whole person, the body, soul together. She references Kitwood, who said dementia sufferers need comfort, attachment, inclusion, occupation, and identity. And these are going to help them move through the anger and fear that they often feel in their dementia. So there's 3 goals for dementia care in her estimation. Affirm the person's personhood, strive for their well-being, and then acknowledge the person's social value. And the question then becomes not how can you communicate with this person who has dementia, but rather, in what way are you present to them? And as a former chaplain, this kind of makes sense to me. So the question is not can you communicate with this person with dementia, but are you really present to them? In fact, people with dementia may be more in tune with their emotions as cognitions diminish. And so then the tool is empathy, where we seek to understand the other as much as possible. And for her, behind all her work is a meta-narrative of hope, inspiration, and comfort, rather than loss and decline. And she seeks to give pastoral support to people in this form in these changes, to help them find hope in the embodied reality of dementia care. So Chapter 2, Grounding Pastoral Care, Spirituality and Meaning. How do you make sense of an experience that's fundamentally doesn't seem inherently reasonable? So what's the roots of coping and resilience in old age? So she's talking about a global meaning framework where a person's beliefs, subjective feelings, goals, and sense of self come together. And she finds that persons' long-held beliefs may be jettisoned in the experience of dementia. But she says there's some things you can really do. You can expect to connect with people with dementia. You can emphasize the nonverbal side of care. So she talks about the failure of others often in the early stages of dementia to try to find ways of establishing continuity of the self with another. She talks about Christine Bryden, who in her book Dancing with Dementia describes how early in her journey she struggled with a loss of self, and later she found that she could rest in God's presence and find herself in God's presence. She actually found that her relationship to Jesus can deepen through the experience of the progress of dementia. So she says people who with dementia are still trying to worship, they're trying to care, have the element of the transcendent in their lives. But memory and tradition often resides in community, in place. So people with with dementia who seek to continue to worship often experience a disruption in that community and so forth, that continuity as well. But loving community and the memory of love persists long after loss, she insists. Okay, so chapter 3, Caregiving, a Lived Experience. As I suggested, here's where her book really takes off. And she interviews a group of a small number of participants, about 6 caregivers in Queensland, across a year. And so she looks for hidden caregivers and for people who are at different stages of the caregiving journey. And she's looking for the challenges of caring, the emotions engendered, the spiritual impact, the support received, and the coping strategies. She starts by telling us about Henri, an 83-year-old French-Australian man caring for his wife Marguerite. They've been married 21 years, and she's had 2 years of decline with no other family in Australia. She's refusing to go to a nursing home, and he's concerned about what will happen to him what will happen to her after he dies. She spends a lot, and she shares her credit card information freely, and he only has one friend that he can talk to. So after his hospitalization for something else, she goes back to Canada to be cared for by her daughter, and then he kind of has this in the middle of dementia care grief of his wife being away from him, and he pines for her. So the present and the future are both on his mind, but in kind of a worried way. Even when his daughter is taking care of his wife, he worries about her. So he talks about powerlessness and confusion and how he interprets, even though he knows the facts about dementia, he still interprets his wife's changes as an unwillingness to act differently. And he thinks of her like a naughty small child or a baby. He can't control her or his own emotions, and so he feels powerless at all the new conflict and fears even going insane sometimes. And he talks about ambiguity and ambivalence, not knowing if her pains and health concerns are well-founded. So he can't decide between that which she can't remember or that which she's not willing to remember. So he's still really expecting her to behave normally. And he feels like she's in the next room, even though she's half the world away in Canada. Part of him is gone. So she describes this as kind of a sense of physical absence, but psychological presence, and isolation and loneliness. So Marguerite is more connected, but Henry only wants to talk to one friend, so he's kind of disconnected as a caregiver. So he gets a chance to talk to his wife, but he sees it as a kind of meaningless chatter and a palpable loneliness. So at home, he faces the loss of his identity as a husband. And he finds that when he tries to talk to his son about this, the son kind of turns the page or doesn't want to talk to him about it. So he really can't make sense of this spiritually in some ways. At the start of his journey, he says that God sustains him. And that then later on, when she checks in on him again, he describes how God is keeping him going. But then later he describes, towards the end of the interviews, how his purpose has been lost and he should be able to die. So a Christian pastor came and visited him and gave him communion, but he says he stopped going to church because he could no longer hear what was being said. So in that story, you see kind of a progression of a male caregiver's journey and his level of social support, and also his process of kind of losing a peer in his life. Then she goes on to talk about Elaine's story, who was married for 55 years. Her husband Colin got Alzheimer's 2 years before, during one of her health episodes, which looked a lot like depression. She takes antidepressants, has a good network of friends. Colin no longer goes to church, but they've had some pastoral visits. 6 months later, communication has gotten hard. He speaks softly and needs more help with activities of daily living. And outside connections are becoming more tenuous. Apart from one friend on a similar journey, friends offer very little support. Elaine's hospitalization meant that Colin went into residential care. So over the year, Elaine tries to hold on to who her husband has been, but she misses the joy of his companionship, especially during their 55th wedding anniversary. She imagines his death kind of preemptively as putting away his body and perhaps perhaps with some relief. So she talks about her ambiguity. Each negative statement she makes, she counters with a positive. She says she won't blame God, but tells God that sometimes the journey seems like too much. So she affirms affirming both sides of the dementia journey is key to coping. She has an intrinsic faith and she prays with the scriptures, but she's stretched beyond her limitations with this serious illness. She tries to figure out what caused the dementia and still tries to help with her church volunteering, but she's reluctant to use the next stage of support available at the church because she feels like it would be a further admission of decline. And then friends fade out. One even asks her on page 43 when her husband will get better, showing not really understanding the illness. So now let's turn to Mary. So Mary was married for 55 years, over 20 years ago, and a stroke, she had a son with intellectual impairment. 5 years ago, a daughter died in an accident, and she talks a lot in her spirituality about seeking to cope by accepting what cannot be changed. She prays the Serenity Prayer a lot. The anniversary of child loss, she's experienced greater support, but not at her own instigation. So then later she's experienced less support, and a priest came by and talked about the dementia in ways that were kind of disappointing, offering what she experienced as platitudes. Mary really feels like her very self is lost in this process and that her social contacts have disintegrated. She needs a chance to chronicle her grief and the changes that have happened in her assumptive world. In praying the Serenity Prayer, she decides that she's been worrying and living on the side of what she can't change, but there's another side that she doesn't have to accept without thinking. She sees coping and help-seeking as mutually exclusive. So coping for her means taking care of it herself. And she says that it's not people's fault when they don't understand the experience. And she has a kind of intrinsic faith that goes beyond the abandonment. And she herself has kind of a career as a counselor, and she wants to have recognition for who she is. And that's part of her caregiving journey as well. Okay, so that was Mary's story. Edward and Evelyn were married for over 55 years when she died with dementia, after 7 years with the disease. He was a missionary minister, and he describes their journey as a long goodbye. One widowed friend he could talk to who understood. Otherwise, he says, although surrounded by people, Edward felt like his journey was a lonely one. In caring for his wife, his own spiritual life has disintegrated. And he had kind of ongoing frustration with the church community because he felt like caring for the elderly tends to be kind of low down on the list. He reported praying a prayer for calm from the Celtic tradition, and also described how he couldn't hear what was happening in worship. He had a kind of theory of his own emotions that if he gave in to his feelings, he would be out of control. And when his physical separation from his wife Evelyn, when she went into care, was really painful for him, he kind of experienced an existential loneliness. He thought that people seemed kind of embarrassed to talk about the dementia journey, more willing to discuss things like heart disease. And he faces the bereavement with a sense of disconnection, feeling increasingly isolated. he says that people, as a retired minister, he thinks people kind of assume that he has it together and he doesn't need any help. And he worries sometimes as he feels a kind of hollowness and tumult inside that maybe he's turned his back on God and he's lost part of himself and also his purpose as a caregiver. So let's gather together. Chapter 4, the caregiver's themes, journeys, themes, and meaning. In the caregiver's journey, Crowther asks, is pastoral care something from the bygone era? And she talks about the burden of dementia and caregiving and the daily functioning and ongoing loss, and how it's especially hard when you're a caregiver for other family and working outside the home. There's constantly misplaced things, questions being asked, and there's and the need for supervision increases throughout the illness. And a need to kind of increase medicine as well throughout the illness. So she talks about the sense of loss, of moving from someone you could count on to someone, your spouse being someone you could count on, to someone who needs help with everything. So changes from day to day in someone's functioning are then combined with other challenges of just health concerns in one's own life, challenges of cancer treatment, diabetes, other major losses, death of adult children and grandchildren. And they talk about, all these caregivers talk about how their personal world shrinks a little bit. Fear of what will happen if they go out. And also just kind of feeling fatigue, wanting to sit in a corner all day. And there's also a disappointment with the spiritual impact of the daily tasks of caring, feeding, and being present. Sometimes there's also physical abuse, being punched or kicked by someone with dementia because of failures of communication. So she says something interesting on page 73. The losses and their emotional impacts are so intertwined that there's no clear distinction. In caregiving, you're both adjusting to the changes, but also remembering what someone was like before. So each change in the illness is a kind of loss and adjustment. And she said that kind of moving to the acceptance of the disease means a loss of the physical closeness of their partner, a loss of the emotional closeness when tough things happen. And then people stop celebrating wedding anniversaries and sometimes kind of protect their loved one. I don't want a lot of people to see one. Holidays and outings are going down. And then there's a kind of deferred sense of self, and especially for people who've made promises not to put their loved one in care. And a lot of times, Crowther seems surprised that the people she talks to don't recognize what they're seeing, what they're going through as grief, even though it was horrendous. So it's kind of, she says, a living loss with sadness, anger, distress, confusion, guilt, and emptiness. And there's also a spiritual aspect to the loss as well. So she talks about how a person used to respond positively to communion, but that goes away, and that being a kind of faith loss as well. And for one caregiver, it took after more than a year to really grieve well, because the caregiving journey was so long. So there were some coping strategies that she picked up on, and some included cognitive control over feelings, crying as a release, talking with someone about it. Only one of her caregivers saw humor in the caregiving. All of them kind of described limits in their hobbies, and how their own things they're interested in get to have to kind of move to the background. One talks about kind of preparing chants or slogans for the caregiving with a faith element so that could kind of pull them through. Many of the people kind of experience a diminishment of spirituality as a part of the journey of caregiving over the year that she followed them. So she noticed a kind of general lack of support, which she interpreted as indifference, only one person in this group of 6 mentioned support from family members. None of them participated in support groups. And none of them mentions the ongoing support of a church community. So that's really one of the main takeaways for pastoral care from the caregiver studies. One got a phone call from a church member and one got a phone call from a community chaplain. But there was a kind of self-blame among some caregivers, wondering if it was not their fault or if their loved one wasn't just a difficult character. But in general, people didn't feel the support of the church in their illness journey when they were, or in the journey of kind of wanting to participate in the sacrament of Holy Communion. They talked about their own help-seeking activities as kind of a sign of weakness. And one person talked about blaming her husband for not exercising his brain enough. So there was a kind of help in talking to Dr. Crowther, Dianne Crowther, about this journey. So it seemed to be helpful to have a kind of empathetic ear for what they were going through, discussing the past qualities of a loved one and what they were like in the past, and then also how they were kind of being cast as a naughty child now, and how the present grief is not mitigated by the long goodbye that it's been. So this was an interesting point from her book. She says that couples kind of build a shared social identity that's renegotiated and reconstructed. And this loss of dementia challenges the couple's identity. Many people who were caregivers found that the couples they knew before kind of backed away. Many of the caregivers did find satisfaction in doing their job well. And they suggest that early pastoral care interventions could have helped more because it would have been ways to gain strength, wisdom, patience, and calm in the midst of turmoil. So especially for 3 different people, about half of this sample, they were highly involved in the church before the dementia journey, but they experienced the church's caregiving support as somewhat minimal in response. So I think I'll pause it here and come back and do a second video on the rest of the book, chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, because that's where Crowther goes from her study to interpreting it in terms of the work she's done on loss. So this was a video on the first part, chapters 1 through 4 of Dianne Crowther's Sustaining Persons, Grieving Losses, a fresh pastoral approach for the challenges of the dementia journey. Thank you for watching.